All right, we are live. So joining me today, extra special guest, Peter Carruthers. Peter, I wonder if you could say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Okay, so I teach at the University of Maryland, have done now for 20 years, I guess. Prior to that, as you can probably tell by an accent, I was in the UK, where I was mostly brought up and went to the University of Leeds and then the University of Oxford. I guess I've been dancing around and writing about consciousness issues now for 30 years, on and off, changing my mind fairly regularly. Some of the stuff I published back 30 years ago is now notorious, and people cite it as examples of clear falsehoods, and indeed I'm quite happy that they should do so. But most recently, the most recent change of mind was when I converted from being a higher order theorist about consciousness to the global workspace theorist. Although there's been, there's quite a lot of continuities between those two. I still think the phenomenal concept strategy is the right way to go to explain why we get puzzled about these things and so on.
Interesting. Yeah. So I have noticed that you changed your mind recently about that. I guess I was curious about sort of what led you to revise your view. I guess I know that you had some arguments against global workspace theory that you eventually came to think weren't really doing the work that you thought that they were. Is that really what happened?
Well, two things happened really. One was that I thought, the arguments that I'd run for my particular idiosyncratic version of higher order theory didn't really work. I mean, I'd always objected that global workspace theory didn't really explain how anything would light up just by virtue of being in the workspace and so on. And then on reflection, I thought, hang on, I'm a reductive theorist about phenomenal consciousness. There's no such thing as lighting up. There's no extra property that gets to be there, right? That's a really bad argument. And yet that had been what had motivated me to push for what I call dual content theory. So the version, as you probably know, the version of higher order thought theory I had was a kind of dispositional version. I thought that by virtue of contents being in the global workspace and available to higher order thought, if you then bought into a kind of consumer semantics, it would be the case that those contents would at the same time acquire a non-conceptual higher order content, right? So a perception of the content read would also have the content seeming read or experience of read.
Right.
And it was that higher order content that I wanted to identify with phenomenal consciousness. But I had no evidence that was true. It requires you to buy into a particular theory of content determination. Mm-hmm. I think I convinced 0 people that it was true. And on reflection, I thought it's unnecessary, right? I mean, that there's no, why not just go with the first order theory and you can still appeal to higher order stuff in explaining why consciousness gets a grip on us, and that's the phenomenal concept strategy. Mm-hmm.
So is the idea, just following up on what you just said right there, is the idea there, so you identify, because you're a reductionist, you're a physicalist, right? I think about mm-hmm. this stuff. You endorse something called qualia irrealism, but I think what you mean by that just is that that phenomenal consciousness is a cognitive phenomenon as opposed to some kind of non-cognitive phenomenon. Is that before I get too distracted, is that the right way of characterizing?
Depends what you mean by cognitive. I mean, so I think it's all and only globally broadcast non-conceptual contents that contribute to phenomenal consciousness, that get to be phenomenally conscious. But that's a kind of orthogonal issue about cognitive phenomenology and whether thoughts are phenomenally conscious and whether concepts are phenomenally conscious and so on. I'm the very thinnest kind of realist about phenomenal consciousness that you can be, in that I think there are truths about it. Mm-hmm. So I think when Mary steps out of her black and white room and thinks, wow, so this is what it's like to experience red, I think she thinks something true. But that's just because she's now thinking a thought that wasn't available to her in her black and white room, because she couldn't think an indexical thought about an experience of red because she had had none.
Right.
Right. So there's truths there, but they're just truths about things that you can characterize fully in third person terms.
Right. So I guess I was using the word cognitive because in the sense of the global broadcasting or global workspace,
Right.
many
Okay.
people would identify that as kind of a cognitive theory. But so what I was trying to get at was that the distinction really is between someone like your view and then someone like Block, who is also a qualia realist. A qualia. Yeah, he's a qualia realist because he denies that there's any kind of extra thing like the broadcasting or access availability to these cognitive systems that is important for consciousness.
Well, in one sense, he's a realist. In another sense, not. I mean, some people use qualia to refer to the dualist view, right? I mean, the non-physical property, and he's certainly not that. I mean, I called him a qualia quasi-realist, I think, at one point in the book, by which I meant just that although he's a physicalist, he thinks that there are phenomenally conscious properties that don't reduce to representational properties or any combination of representation and causal role.
Right. Okay. So, right. Okay. So that now getting back to a question I was trying to formulate a second ago, the idea, so you identify the phenomenal consciousness with the global workspace theory, and then you say, well, there still are these consumer systems, and those, instead of identifying, maybe these non-conceptual contents will acquire a second content, like your original theory kind of postulated. But that theory, that is not going to be identified with phenomenal consciousness, but rather that's like our concept of the phenomenal consciousness.
Well, I mean, I no longer think that it probably does acquire a higher order non-conceptual content. I mean,
Okay.
I backed off thinking that that's going to be a consequence of availability to higher order thought, partly because I've become much more externalist about views about content and how contents get determined. So no, I've now the view is just non-conceptual contents available in the global workspace get to be available to think these special thoughts that we can think, and so they're the things that we refer to when we think using our first-person concepts. So this is what it's like to see red, or when I die, all this will disappear, meaning to refer to phenomenal experience in general.
Okay, yeah, because that's interesting, because that's one of the things I was a bit, when I was reading the book, which by the way is a great book. I mean, you put out a lot of books, but your last two have been really, really good. The Centered Mind and
Thank you.
Yeah, I really, really, really enjoyed that one. And then of course the Human and Animal Minds, which I guess is your most recent one, are both really, whether you agree with them or not, I think they're really tremendous pieces of work that everyone should read. So that's a plug for the books. But anyway, I don't have physical copies. I have my PDF over here.
Oh, well, look, if you want to see what it looks like, it's surely the most beautiful cover ever. Can
Really
you see
is.
that?
Yeah, I could. It's in an era where book covers are becoming progressively more kind of cheesy and abstract. I think this one stands out as really cool. So it's nice that they did that. But so I was confused a little bit because I was wondering whether you had given up this dual content idea. And so you clarified that for me. So the idea is just that there are higher order thoughts, but now they're much more sort of like the traditional ones where they have the conceptual context. I'm in this state.
Yep.
Okay. And then one of the things about phenomenal consciousness, I mean, there's a lot of implications that follow from this kind of conversion of yours to global workspace. And I think a lot of your recent work has been exploring this. So like the idea that there's no conscious thoughts or beliefs, for example, is a consequence of this. The implications for animal consciousness is an implication of this. So I think it's really interesting that you're thinking through these issues. And of course, I want to talk about them. But before we get to that stuff, just talking about phenomenal consciousness in general, I think that you have an interesting way of sort of saying what the target phenomenon is supposed to be, because as far as I understand it, the way you talk about it is phenomenal consciousness is that thing which puzzles us and gives rise to these hard problem intuitions. That's really the thing that we're trying to explain or understand. So if a theory doesn't really give rise to those sorts of intuitions, then it's not really addressing that kind of question. So do you think first of all, is that accurate? And then is this related to what Chalmers has called the meta problem? Is that something that you think is related to this way of formulating it or not?
Yeah, I think it's essentially the same as the meta problem. I mean, basically, I think, as Ned Block argued many years ago, phenomenal consciousness is a first-person notion, right? I mean, it's that when we talk about, use phrases like what it's like and so on, that's really just an invitation to people to pay attention to their own experiences and to verify whether what's being said is true from their own first-person perspective too. And that's why I think that phenomenal concepts are the primary phenomenal concepts, right? They're the basis of it all. But of course, we have to talk about phenomenal consciousness. And I think that the best way to operationalize it third person is to say something like, well, it's that set of properties that gives rise to the hard problem thought experiments, whatever they are, right? And that doesn't beg any questions about, which kind of theory of consciousness is true or anything of that kind. But it does make the commitment that if you come across a kind of property that some people want to claim is phenomenally conscious but doesn't give rise to those puzzles, and that's what I think is true of concepts and conceptual content, then it's entailed that they're not phenomenally conscious. They may be in the workspace, and I think they are, and they may be globally broadcast, and I think they are, but they don't give rise to those puzzles, and so don't qualify as phenomenally conscious. That's the split.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And I want to talk about the cognitive stuff in a little bit, but I do wonder about, so people who think that, well, I guess, so illusionists, you say very carefully in the book, you're not an illusionist, although you're sort of share the same spirit as them, right?
Yeah.
In a sense, but you're not an illusionist. And so illusionists are going to deny that there's a hard problem typically. Is that the way so is that one of the differences between you and the illusionists?
No, because I deny that there's a hard problem too.
That there seems
in the sense of a real gap. So I share with the illusionists the view that there just seems to be a problem, right? It's just, I think it's a bit weird to call it an illusion because, I mean, all other cases where people talk about illusions are universal, automatic, set things up right, and everyone just feels the illusion, right? So cognitive illusions of the sort that Vesky and Kahneman would deal with, and visual illusions. Whereas I think the problem of consciousness is something that philosophers get you tangled in, right? And it requires work to get people to feel the problem of consciousness. You can't just say, hey, look, pay attention to your experience. What do you think, right? You've got to, I mean, you'll probably know this from teaching yourself, that it sometimes requires a good deal of work to get students to even feel that there's a problem. So I think, I mean, that's the only reason I say I'm not an illusionist. It's just that I think, it's a much more cognitive kind of problem rather than something that's just given as part of our experience.
Right. So then to put it slightly differently on the way you're thinking about things, if illusionism were really true, then the intuitions about hard problems would be automatic and you wouldn't need much prodding at all. It'd be like Mueller liar. You just show them, they're like, oh yeah, okay, we get it.
Yeah, that's the thought.
Things are.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. But does on this view, does this imply that the folk, I guess, don't have the concept of phenomenal consciousness because they get puzzled by it, or?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it mostly means that. I mean, most people will at some point or another pay attention to their own experiences as such and may think a Mary-like thought. Oh, so this is what it's like to smell cinnamon, or right? And to the extent that they are, they're then thinking about a phenomenally conscious state. They're employing a phenomenal concept to think about that state. But that isn't quite the same, I guess, as having a generalized concept of phenomenal consciousness.
Right.
Yeah, so I think many ordinary folk will employ what are in effect phenomenal concepts. And so if you draw their attention to those concepts, and that's part of what I think we do with students, is you say, well, look, focus on this really bright shade of red and ask yourself, how do you know that someone else has got what you've got now as you introspect when they're looking at this rather than what they get when they look at this bright green thing, right? And,
right.
So in effect, you're just inviting them to deploy phenomenal concepts that they might have deployed anyway to see a generalized problem.
Yeah, because I think another way of thinking about this is that, phenomenal consciousness is like a technical term for something that's an ordinary thing, and that people are thinking about it all the time. I mean, I know I'm not maybe typical because I grew up to be a philosopher, but I remember, first time I had kimchi, I did have one of those thoughts. I was like, oh, this is what it's like to taste kimchi. Well, I didn't quite guess it. And I would wonder, why can't I just tell the doctor can't he just like feel my pains? Why is he always asking me like, how's it feel? Like, I don't know how to tell you. So I was always having these sort of weird kind of thoughts about my own experience, but maybe I was an outlier in that case. But I do sort of feel like ordinary persons have a grasp on what we mean by consciousness, in the sense of having sort of like the Eric Switchable line, right? You define it kind of innocently as it's perception in good cases, it's emotional experience.
Oh, well, but now there's a real risk of tangling up issues about phenomenal consciousness with all kinds of other things that people use the word conscious to mean.
Right.
Which I think are just third person, entirely innocent, don't necessarily give rise to any problems about ascribing them to animals or whatever. So there's conscious of. I mean, look, you should know this stuff. This is all Rosenthal's distinctions that he drew many years ago, right? There's being conscious of something, and there's being conscious as opposed to unconscious. And we know every animal that exists has a wake-asleep cycle. There's no problem about them being conscious as opposed to unconscious in that sense. So I do think, although ordinary people use the term conscious a lot of the time they're not talking about phenomenal consciousness per se. They may be talking about states which are phenomenally conscious,
right,
but not necessarily as such. They're just talking about perception or awareness or.
Right. I guess, because you're right. They don't make the distinction between creature conscious, transitive conscious, all these technical terms
right.
that we have in the literature. But still in their own case. So yeah, well, I guess I can see what you're saying. So and in fact, a lot of professionals do this as well. They confuse these concepts together.
And so
I know part of your argument against some of these other theories is that they partially confuse some of these concepts. Okay, so yeah, that's interesting. I want so bad to have thought of my previous self as a part of the folk, and I'd be like a difficult person, but maybe not. Okay. So I want to also so these are the preliminary issues that are really going to pull a lot of weight later on. But one of the main ones is this idea about consciousness being all or nothing, the phenomenal consciousness in particular. So these other notions admit of gradations. You could be half asleep, partially awake. Sort of aware of something. But when it comes to phenomenal consciousness, I share your intuition very strongly that there's something that is like or there isn't. And that's a very important kind of claim, because it's going to do a lot of work with the animal stuff later in the discussion.
Yeah. No, I mean, given that phenomenal consciousness is a version of state consciousness, right? Any given mental state of yours will be phenomenally conscious or not, although it can vary along every other dimension, right? I mean, you can have, one of the examples I use is, imagine walking home in the dark and you just see some vague shape looming in the shadows, right? You don't know what you're seeing in terms of consciousness of,
right.
And there's very little content to what you're conscious of. It's just a vague shape. But nevertheless, it's definitely like something to see a vague shape. And similarly with these things that experimenters will flash up on the screen for 20 milliseconds and then either successfully mask or not, right? If they don't successfully mask it, well, it's definitely like something to see a flash of something I know not what, even if you can't say what it is and there's no other content there. But,
yeah. So I think a lot of the confusion around this is exactly as you just brought out, that people are not distinguishing between the content, like what the contents of the conscious experience are, and whether it's phenomenally conscious at all. And so they confuse the graded content with like level of consciousness.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of this, and you make a point of saying this in the book, part of the issue here is that from our own first person, we don't really encounter cases that are kind of like something or partially like something.
Right.
But if, like, how would I put this? If consciousness were graded, would you expect that we would have those kinds of experiences? Or to put it differently, maybe our kind of consciousness is all or nothing, but I'm not sure why we would extrapolate to every kind of experience being that way from our own case.
Well, I mean, look, here it matters whether you employ the first person concept or the third person concept. So if you ask, so concerning whatever it is that gives rise to the hard problem of consciousness, does that admit of degrees? Well, for me, what gives rise to the hard problem of consciousness is globally broadcast non-conceptual content. And of course, what qualifies as global broadcast admits of degrees across species and to some extent within humans too, right? So in humans, the broadcast includes availability to language faculty, to reporting, right? In other species, it will not.
Right.
In humans, it's available to all kinds of aspects of executive function that other animals might lack, and so on. So broadcasting admits of degrees, and so, as it were, described third personally, that which gives rise to the hard problem admits of degrees. But when you use the basic kind of phenomenal concept and you think, could there be something that's, and you focus on a phenomenally conscious experience, this is like something. Could there be something that's sort of quasi-like something? And I just don't know how to get my head around the topic. Right? I mean, I can't make any sense of the question.
Yeah, but I guess, and to be honest, like I'm playing devil's advocate in a sense because I agree with you. I share that intuition. But I guess on the other side, though, couldn't someone say, well, that's a failure of imagination, or like an argument from incredulity, or in the worst case, like that, we're just like, try, Dennett would come over here and say, try harder.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that may be right, and that's why I was pleased it wasn't the only argument I had to rely on in the book. I mean, that one gave rise to what I call the negative semantic argument, where I say something like, there's nothing in our first person uses which fixes where in the set of changes as you move across animal species and different forms of global broadcasting, phenomenal consciousness would end. Right? There's nothing in our first person use that carries any implications about what would be so. So it's going to be a matter of stipulation, given that there's no real extra property, right?
Right.
If I were quasi a realist, there'd be a fact of the matter, even if I could never know. But given that there isn't, given that all there really is experiences that are available to more and more complex systems as you move across species, and then at some point you get to creatures that can get puzzled by the hard problem. But there's no extra property that pops into existence at any point there. So it's just going to be stipulation if you say, well, here is where phenomenal consciousness starts, right? But then I have a different sort of argument, the positive semantic argument that doesn't rely on this gradation stuff or lack of gradation stuff.
Yeah, okay, so I want to get into that positive semantic argument, but before we do that, one of the questions that was really kept popping up in my mind as I was thinking through this stuff. Well, first of all, I think so the basic argument is there's a dilemma. You're either a qualia realist or not. If you're a qualia realist, then whether animals are consciousness, we can't know which ones. And if you aren't, then there's just no fact of the matter about whether they are or not. And I mean, part of me was thinking, I don't really understand what it means for there not to be a fact of the matter. Like I sort of know what it means for there to be no fact of the matter about whether they have a global broadcasting system like ours. That's clear, I think. There's gradations there. But what it means to be no fact of the matter about phenomenal consciousness, that's different than saying they aren't phenomenally conscious.
Oh, yeah.
But so what exactly does no fact of the matter on your way of thinking about these? What does that mean? that it's just not an interesting question, or is it something more metaphysically?
It means it's indeterminate. So,
well, I have a trouble between understanding the difference between indeterminate and we don't know. So,
all right, okay. I mean, I think this may be shifting into the positive semantic argument, but in one way of thinking about at least some of the arguments I run is that what you have when you attribute phenomenal consciousness to animals or ask the question about phenomenal consciousness in animals is a failed presupposition, right? So is there a fact of the matter about whether I've stopped beating my wife yet? Right?
Yeah.
Supposing that I never did.
Yeah, right.
And never have, right? Well, there's no yes, no answer, right? And that's the bind you get into when someone asks you a question that has a false presupposition, right? And so there is no fact of the matter about whether I've stopped beating my wife yet. I mean, there is a nearby fact of the matter, namely I never have, right? And I'm not now. But that question doesn't admit of a true-false answer, right? And I think that's a situation wherein, with respect to projecting phenomenal concepts into animals, and okay, so sorry, this is into the positive semantic argument. I think in the end, what just fixes the truth conditions for a first-person phenomenal concept is not any public norms. There aren't any, and not any, commitments to natural kinds or anything. There's just one's own judgmental dispositions. Mm-hmm. It's the way one's disposed to use the concept of this sort of experience. And then when you ask, so does a monkey have this sort of experience? In effect, you're asking the question, supposing that my dispositions to judge, the ones that I'm currently using, were to be present in the mind of a monkey, would they then issue in a positive judgment? And I think the false presupposition there is that these dispositions to judge could be in the mind of a monkey without changing the mind of the monkey, right? Without the mind of the monkey being radically different from the mind that it actually has, right? So there's no way to project those dispositions deeply across species. I mean, maybe there are borderline cases, but certainly not to cats and dogs, say.
Right. So the idea is then, so that's helpful, because the idea is that there's a false presupposition when we think about animal consciousness.
Right. And so the presupposition is that, how to put it? Yeah, okay. The presupposition is that the dispositions to judge that underlie your use of the concept could exist in the unchanged mind of the animal. Right? Could exist in the animal that you're actually the target of your thought, namely the way the dog actually is, not a dog souped up with extra phenomenal concepts that would require, higher order thinking and capacities for reflective thought and maybe language in order to have them.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. So I want to put a pin in that, because I want to ask something and then see how you answer it and come back to this, because okay. One of the questions I had was, okay, so suppose that we, I don't know, in the course of the universe's time, either, create a super intelligent artificial system or meet some very advanced alien race. I think really it could be either way. And let's suppose that we have reason to think they're conscious, although I am curious about your views about artificial consciousness, and maybe you can answer that if you care to. But suppose we have reasons to think that let's just stipulate that they're phenomenally conscious. And they have something like a global workspace, but it's much more sophisticated than ours, with a lot more, because they're super intelligent, just very advanced. Then couldn't they run that argument against us and conclude that we're not phenomenally conscious, or there's no fact of the matter about whether we're conscious, because it's a graded notion and our system is not as advanced as theirs and lacks all these further components or whatever? And isn't that like a reductio of the kind of argument?
Oh gosh, so I address exactly that somewhere in the book.
Yeah.
And I'm damned if I can remember what I say. I think that one thing I say is that if you imagine that their cognitive architecture is just an extension of ours, right? So maybe they've got some faculty that enables them to do advanced mathematics instantaneously or something, right? Or they've got executive function capacities that enable them to resist that second marshmallow indefinitely, or right? But at the core of it, they've still got a global workspace, and they've got capacities for reflective thinking, and they've got higher order concepts, right? Then, yeah, when they raise the question of phenomenal consciousness about us, they'd be wrong if they said, oh, our concepts wouldn't apply there, right? Because the relevant components, the relevant bits that you need in order to employ a phenomenal concept are present in both them and us, even though they've got some extra stuff. So it makes sense that you could take those very dispositions and, as it were, put them into the human mind and get a determinate judgment. But on the other hand, if you imagine that their cognitive architecture is just completely different, right? I mean, who knows? I mean, it's different from us as we are from the octopus, so far as we can gather about octopi minds, which have 9 brains, it seems, right? I mean, so there's a sort of central one, and then there's a separate brain that controls each arm, and it's quite unclear what's going on.
Yeah.
So suppose they're an alien species of super octopi or something. Then I think it might well be the case that whatever they mean by phenomenal consciousness wouldn't apply to us, but equally in reverse. I mean, then I can't get my head around the reverse thing you gave as a stipulation at the outset, namely they are phenomenally conscious, because for me that means if the dispositions underlying my use of the concept this were to be instantiated in that creature, then they would be, because now they couldn't be instantiated in that creature without totally reorganizing that organism's mind, right? Because, yeah. So I think I try and do a sort of divide and conquer reply, as I recall.
Yeah, interesting. So this idea, I mean, so the reason why I was asking that is because in our own case, if we selectively impaired these faculties, like the broadcasted to faculties one by one, but left all of the other ones intact. So let's selectively impair just the language one, like we'll just TMS it or whatever, so knockout right here. There you go. Now the language faculty doesn't receive the information. Then we selectively impair, we just go around. And so now we selectively impair the higher order faculty. So you can't have these thoughts. Then is the view that the phenomenal consciousness disappears at a certain point if one of these is taken offline?
Rather, there comes a point where there's no fact to the matter, because there'll come a point where you can't ask anymore, right? You can't say, hey, have you got an experience like this one or something, because the person can't talk and they can't have higher order thoughts about their own experiences. Right? And yet the projecting the dispositions to judge into the mind of that person likewise makes a false presupposition, right? So that person's mind would not be in the state that it's actually in, the state that's the target of our thoughts, if it contained the dispositions to judge that I've now got, right? Because that would imply that its language faculty wasn't impaired and its higher order thought faculty wasn't impaired, and so on. Right? So I say, yeah, there are cases of no fact to the matter about humans too.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things why I was puzzled by this is because you have changed your mind, it seems, in a more dramatic way than maybe I thought of at first. Because the way I understood the dual content theory, your original theory, was that it's just availability that matters, not actually being encoded or anything like that. Just it's got to be available. But now it sounds like what you're saying is, no, it's more than just availability. It's more than just being broadcasted. It's actually got to be received. Something's got to be done with it.
Oh,
does it have to be?
So there's two different notions of availability here. I mean, Bloch draws this distinction somewhere, right? So there's, for him, something can be available which isn't currently being received by other systems, right? But it could be, if attended to, for example. That's what he thinks his fragile working memory contents are. They're available, but not received. No, I'd always intended that the conscious contents were ones that were actually being processed by, or at least received as input by, the consumer systems. I mean, whether they're actually doing anything with it is another matter, right? So you could, like, I mean, much as Ty back in '95 talked about conscious contents being those that are poised for use by executive systems, it's, as it were, the knocking on the door that constitutes it as conscious, not what gets done downstream. And it might be, I mean, so one way to think about dreaming is that it might be a bit like this, right? That there's globally broadcast contents available to executive systems and to language reporting systems, but those are all suppressed. And so nothing is actually done with them, done with those contents, right? They just sort of go out there and then fade away, and yet would still be phenomenally conscious.
So they have to be, so the idea is they have to be sort of on deck, as it were, like literally.
Yeah.
It's not just that the information is being sent, the information has to be received, and whether it's being employed right away or not, it's got to be like in my dock, so to speak.
Yeah, that's the picture.
Okay.
And I think it always was the picture.
I see. So I think
remembering back 20 years now, but yeah, I think it always was.
Because I've always had a problem understanding what people use the word availability in a lot of different ways, and it's I think someone like Jesse Prince uses it in a more liberal manner, where he just means like the information is being sent. If there's a stream going out, then that's consciousness. Right. And whether it's ever picked up by anyone ever in the brain at all, it doesn't really matter on his view. Whereas you need the receiver end, and then what doesn't matter is whether it gets utilized right away.
Yeah.
And is this the, just as a tangential idea here, is this the basis of your, I'm thinking of a paper you had where you were talking about Ned Bloch's overflow argument and sort of reconcile it with your views. Is this part of your reconciliation, the idea that it's there but not being used?
It was. Now let me try and remember that. I mean, the trouble is that almost as soon as I published that little short paper, I thought I'd made a mistake because I came across some other empirical work that suggested it was wrong. The idea in that paper on Ned Bloch was an alternative explanation of richness, where you could grant Ned the richness of conscious experience while hanging on to the paucity of working memory by saying, well, maybe more information can get broadcast out than can be sustained. And it made sort of intuitive sense, right? Because you think when you've got, if what happens with attention is that sort of boosts and selects representations to get it into the global workspace, right? When you've got an incoming stimulus, it's already sort of active, right? And you might think it requires less attention in order to get it into the workspace than is required to hold it there when you've no longer got input.
Right.
That was the picture.
Right.
So maybe more can get broadcast, but then you can only hang on to so much. Right? That was the picture. But there's really nice evidence by, Tsubomi et al., as I recall, suggesting that isn't so, where they do a limits of working memory task where instead of there being a gap between stimulus offset and identifying whether something has changed, the normal kind of thing, it's immediate. So you see a bunch of colored squares, all disappear except one, which is now split in half one half of it retaining the original color and the other being a color drawn from elsewhere in the display.
Mhm.
And you just have to say which is the original color. Right? And when you crunch the math and so on, you end up with the same 4-item limit that you get in retention cases.
Ah.
And so that suggested to me that actually the bandwidth of broadcasting is the same as the bandwidth of sustaining.
I see. So the idea is that the amount of information that's being broadcast is like 4 items, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But a lot of detail about those 4 items, right? So there's no.
Well, yeah. So you've got, I mean, you've got properties that are bound into those items. I mean, the way I think of it is like an object file where you can bound in shape and color and texture and so forth. And it's not quite that all that information comes for free, but it looks like sort of that you can. I mean, there are another set of experiments they did, for example, where you can put up the usual array of items and see how many people can retain, and then test them for whether they can retain color, whether they can retain shape, whether they can retain orientation. And it turns out all of those extra properties are coming for free, right? I mean,
Interesting. Okay, so no, you're no longer inclined to defend the idea that richness is a property of our experience.
Well, not in block sense of richness. I mean, there's a certain amount of richness, but it's a lot less than intuitively we think is there. And I don't believe the sort of 8-item limit that Block believes in, or the 12-item limit, or whatever it is that is the limit of fragile working memory.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's okay. And so a lot of this, of course, we've been talking about different theories of consciousness, and that's because you think this is the only way to make progress on this issue. So I mean, with respect to animals and so forth. So we've got to start by looking at the human case, figure out what theory of consciousness best fits our case, and then and only then really should we start extrapolating out to these other kinds of cases.
Yeah, that's the picture. I mean, I don't think there's an easy way of doing it. I mean, a non-theory laden way of doing it. I mean, so a whole chapter of the book is, well, partly what got me writing the book was reading Michael Tye's lovely book on I don't know, what is it, fractious bees and anxious crabs or something, else the other way around. And he basically tries to run a theory-free argument for
he
consciousness.
invokes Newton's principle, as he calls it.
Yeah.
Which is the idea that similar effects should have similar causes.
Yeah. And so I spent a whole chapter saying why that won't work. In part because he just, I mean, he seems to have forgotten about all the whole range of unconscious experiences that we know about, again, from the human case, that can nevertheless cause flexible forms of behavior, the sort of behavior that, if you saw it in a cat, you'd intuitively think, oh, conscious, because you'd intuitively think that about a human. Right. But it turns out not.
So that brings up an interesting kind of idea, because one of the things that I thought that I detected was that you think consciousness is important for a kind of flexible guidance of behavior. One of the examples you use is the long-range truck driver, right? Our famous example. You have to sort of snap to in order to deal with the accident or the kid that jumped out in front of you, as your example, right? The child in the street or whatever the case may be. And so, yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying now is though that consciousness may be not required for flexible control of behavior.
So it's okay. So there's two things here. There's a bunch of cases where behavior is actually controlled by unconscious states, where one would take it to be flexible. I mean, if you see someone driving down the road and avoiding obstacles, you would intuitively think that person is conscious. Right. Why did he swerve around the parked car? Because he was aware of it or was conscious of it, or right? But that may not be true because it's just part of routine driving. And it's only the truly unexpected thing, right? The kid that races out after the ball or something, right? That makes you snap to. And it's not actually clear that you need to snap to in order to avoid the child. It's just that it attracts attention in a way that the parked car doesn't, because the parked car is routine. The child in the way sends a sort of alarm signal, right? And that has the function of attracting attention, and so it makes it conscious. But actually, you're probably responding before it becomes conscious,
Right.
Because it takes half a second almost for input to reach the level of consciousness, at least on a global workspace theory approach, and you probably hit the brakes before then.
Right.
But yeah, even for cases where we know for sure that it's phenomenally conscious states that are playing a role in making it flexible. So if you think of cases like prospective reasoning, right, where you're thinking, well, I've got that job offer, should I take it or not, right? And you're imagining what it'd be like to live in that city. You're trying to picture yourself having conversations with those new colleagues. You're reminding yourself of what your present place is like, and so on. So you're engaging in a form of flexible reasoning that involves conscious experiences. Seems to be an open question whether the conscious component of it is playing any causal role. Right. So it might just be the contents, the first order contents, that actually guide the reasoning, right? So it's, imagining this thing evokes positive affect, and so it seems good, and imagining this thing evokes negative affect, and so it seems bad, and it's all happening on a first order level, although the imagined experiences are in fact conscious ones and available for higher order thought and all that other stuff. It's just all that stuff isn't doing the work.
Yeah, it's almost incidental to what's actually it's the content, like what the contents, the intentional conceptual contents that are doing the work.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I felt like it's a little bit of the idea of flexible behavior. I mean, a lot of people want to use that as a way to say, well, look, of course the cat is conscious. Look what it's doing. It's stalking its prey, and something jumps out and it flexibly avoids it's adapting to its environment. And there's almost no mammals, which are, as you point out in the book, I think at one point, that have this kind of rigid behavior, like the certain spider or wasp or whatever, which does the same thing over and over when you mess with it. Mammals don't behave that way. So clearly, whatever the issue about phenomenal consciousness is, they aren't like Descartes' brute machines. Animals are not simply unconscious in that sense, the way Descartes thought.
No, for sure. I mean, I'm full card-carrying continuity theorist about the minds of humans and animals. And for sure, the cat is aware of the mouse as the mouse comes out of its hole, right? So this is transitive creature consciousness,
right?
And the cat has some executive function capacities. I mean, for example, very patient. I mean, the cat can do what a little kid often can't do, which is wait, right? And this is true of most predators, that they tend to be really good at suppressing the impulse to approach what it is they want until conditions are exactly right. Yeah? Whereas other animals and humans in many circumstances aren't so good at that, right? You see what you want, and there's this really strong impulse to go get it. So yeah, there's executive function abilities, there's something like a global workspace, there's certainly attentional abilities. So continuity of mind. Whether there's continuity of phenomenal consciousness, though, is quite another matter, because I think that's this really special first person, what I'm aware of right now kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, another plug for the book. One of the great things about it is there's a whole chapter sort of nailing down this idea that animals do have mental states. There's this huge continuity between us. That's something that's largely unargued for. I mean, people don't usually spend the time in these sorts of books going through that. So I thought that was really nice to go through all the evidence, and there's some great stories. I really like the story about the ape that threw the rocks at the zoo.
Yeah, that was an example of advanced planning. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Very advanced planning. That was one very clever ape hiding those things around and all that sort of stuff. So there's this. So it does bring up the question of what the point, though, of consciousness is, because, these animals are very sophisticated in their behavioral responses. Now, of course, they're not doing, algebra, higher order math, and so forth, and so on. But they're doing very sophisticated things that are very flexible, guided by the environment and in ways that clearly make them, they're sensitive to it. So now in our case, there's phenomenal consciousness as well as all that other stuff. But, as we were just talking about a second ago, if you did some various messing around, you could sort of make it no fact of the matter about us as well.
Mhm.
So what, on your view, do you think there's any role, the function for consciousness specifically, or is it really just,
Nope.
yeah, okay.
No, because I mean, what does the work is content in the global workspace. And it just so happens that the content in the global workspace in humans is available to systems that can formulate higher order thoughts, available to systems that can engage in reflective thinking, and so on. And that means you can formulate phenomenal concepts, and now you can get, but the concept is just a concept which is in a first person way picking out a globally broadcast non-conceptual content. There's no extra property that dropped into the world when phenomenal consciousness arose. I mean, there just was, well, so the picture is something like this. You can survey the range of creatures with, we've got humans up here and we've got bees down here, and I think there's mentality all the way through. And what you get as you move across that space is a really complicated, multi-dimensional similarity space of minds, right? Whereas some creatures will have more sophisticated concepts, some will have more sophisticated executive function abilities, some will have higher order thought, some will not, and so on. And that's really interesting and worth studying. And as a reductive theorist about phenomenal consciousness, I think that, okay, so you've got these first-person phenomenal conscious properties when you get to humans, but that just is the states that are picked out by our phenomenal concepts. And those states are just globally broadcast states. There's no extra property that came into the world at that point, right? Or at any point in this sequence, other than perfectly ordinary third-personally describable properties like higher order thought capacities or executive function capacities for reflective thinking, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think typically global workspace type theorists like to say, well, there's a lot of function associated with consciousness, as that's what global workspace is, and it does all that. You can't do all these things without this and being broadcasted. And so I think that's an interesting part of your view is you want to sort of cleave off those two things and say, well, the functionality isn't really due to the consciousness bit, but rather just to the global broadcasting, the fact that it's connected to behavior.
Right. But differently, the functionality comes from the access consciousness bit and not from the phenomenal consciousness bit, drawing that distinction that conceptual distinction between the two. I mean, I think they both pick out the same property, if you like, but phenomenal consciousness.
I was just going to ask on that note, do you think, so I guess I have the answer, but let me just check. So would you also say the cat isn't access conscious either? Doesn't have access conscious states?
Oh, the answer to that is to some degree yes, to some degree no. Right? The cat has attentional abilities. Attention in the cat plays a similar sort of role that it plays in humans, in that it selects and boosts and suppresses competing representations. And the result of that is that representations are made available to other broadly executive systems and long-term memory systems, but the systems differ. Right? So if you want to identify global broadcasting just with attention, then yes, it's a definite yes. If you say, no, I mean global broadcasting, where your model is the human one initially, then to some degree yes, to some degree no, because the systems broadcast to are to some degree similar, to some degree dissimilar.
But I noticed that the answer is not indeterminate.
No, because now we're dealing with the third person concept of phenomenal consciousness, right? And there, yeah, it's all perfectly straightforward what's going on, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
So
it's a matter of degree, and there's no deep question there.
it's kind of sort of they do, and sometimes they
Mhm.
something like it. But I mean, so someone is asking, just before I get too distracted, someone is asking in the chat. Trevor Caruso is asking, in your view, does the cat need the representational content of the mouse to stalk it? I think the answer is yes, right? The
Yeah,
cat's
absolutely.
representing the mouse, and
I mean, quite how the cat conceives of the mouse is an interesting question, right? I mean, it's often really hard to know quite how other animals are carving up the world, and their concepts may be incommensurable with ours. But yeah, there will, for sure, there will be a representational mental state that has the mouse as its target.
And so the reason I was asking about the access consciousness thing is because I think it's interesting. Maybe there's a little bit of a tension here. I'm not sure, but so you want to say access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness are conceptually distinct, but in the human case, they are the same thing.
Right.
But in the animal case, they aren't the same thing. So I guess I'm wondering, yeah. So it seems like why, yeah. Anyway, so what do you think about that? Is that is tension on your view?
I don't think so, because what is the same thing in humans is the full, rich notion of global workspace, the one that includes higher order thought and language and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So there can be an identity there. And yet once you've moved to a different kind of global workspace, right? That's no longer identical to the thing that's identical to what we've got. It's more or less similar to the thing that we've got. And so it can be the case that there's no fact of the matter about whether there's an identity there.
I mean, it's sort of, I mean, maybe this is I know it's an oversimplification, but it's sort of starting to sound like what you're really saying is that, well, in our case, we pick something out that's globally broadcast, and that's, we call it, we're puzzled about that thing because of these concepts. And so that's what phenomenal consciousness is, but it's not really like a deep or important or interesting property about us. It's just so that we have these concepts. And so if the animal minds were different and they had these concepts, then what they had too would count. But they don't. And so, I mean, I'm not thinking about a souped up cat mind or something like that, but if the cat mind had evolved slightly differently so that there was a little module that could be like, what's this thing over here? Then you would say, well, that counts because they have it. So it really sounds like, well, this is just a theory of the thing. Well, I guess you already said that's a theory of the thing that we find puzzling in our case, but not in any other case.
Right. I mean, so the ultimate target of explanation, at least for the problem of consciousness, as opposed to the problem of the distribution of consciousness, right, across the animal kingdom. For the problem of consciousness is I guess, what Chalmers calls the meta problem. It's what is it that gets us so tangled and puzzled and so forth about these distinctive states. And there, I think the answer is, well, nothing about the states that's terribly interesting. It's just the fact that we can deploy these phenomenal concepts, and it's that gets us into tangles and enables us to conceive of zombies and inverted spectra and all that stuff. So by explaining how we get stuck in the puzzles, we explain why as it were, the actual subject matter is just not interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting view. It's a deflationary view in a sense. I mean, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I guess, so what if we could enhance our phenomenal concepts, would we then, we just stop caring about this? Because I guess first of all, I want you to say a little bit about what you mean by phenomenal concepts, because you have a whole story about them and how you might think that solves or answers the meta problem. Do you think it does answer the meta problem?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so for me, and this is actually something else that I've changed my mind on and become more like Jesse and less like Carruthers of 2000. I think that they're higher order indexical concepts that are formed on the fly, right? So in fact, you're referring to a globally broadcast experience, but not under that description, indeed not under any description, right? You think so, oh, right, so this is what it's like, or when I die, all this will disappear. And you're tacitly in the background employing a higher order concept like experience in order to make the thought be about the experience rather than about the first order content of the experience, right? So when I say all this will disappear, I don't mean the world.
Right.
I don't mean the trees that are currently in front of me and all that stuff, right? Of course, I mean my experience of the world. But I don't conceptualize it as such explicitly. So there's no surface contradiction then in thinking some of the weirder thoughts that one can think that philosophers try to get us puzzled about. Right? There could be a creature that has all of the same contents as me and so forth, but he nevertheless lacks this. And although the this is in fact a representation of trees, and I've just said that the creature has a representation of trees, there's no entailment from the one to the other, right? Because I'm not conceptualizing it as such. So I think given that, so back up a little bit, I mean, you sort of asked what these concepts are. The way they get applied to globally broadcast contents, I use the word acquaintance, but there's nothing metaphysically deep there. It's just whatever goes on when a content is globally broadcast and you make a first order judgment. Oh, that's a nice shade of green, or that's a big tree, right? You've got contents available to judgmental systems, concept wielding systems, right? And that enables a direct thought about the object of the experience. Well, likewise, when those very same contents are made available to concept wielding systems that also have higher order thought capacities, you can now deploy a concept about that experience, right? But there's no magic, there's no coming into contact with one's own experiential properties or something, right? It's just global broadcasting to conceptual systems that's involved. But that's what enables you to conceive of zombies and feel that there's an explanatory gap and all that stuff.
Right. So that's what generates all the puzzles. But so I know you have this footnote about the acquaintance being anodyne, but I guess does that really count as acquaintance? I mean, basically what
I don't care. I mean, if you think, no, the notion of acquaintance is this richer thing, fine. I'll substitute, availability to conceptual systems or being received by conceptual systems or something like that.
Okay, I see. Yeah, interesting. And I see another question here from Victor Barcelos. I don't know if I'm saying the right name, but he's asking what you think about non-neurotypical persons. Do you think there's gradations amongst humans?
I think that there are a bunch of borderline cases for whether there's a fact of the matter or not, right? So the claim that whether a crow is phenomenally conscious there's no fact of the matter there is not supposed to be a borderline thing, right? But for sure there'll be borderline cases amongst humans. I mean, think of neural development, right? So you've got a fetus that is growing and developing and getting a brain, and it's born, and at those early stages, it doesn't have any of the capacities for deploying phenomenal concepts, right? To try and think, well, if the dispositions underlying my current concept, this were instantiated in the mind of the fetus, would it be, well, that is just, there's no fact of the matter there any more than there is with the monkey, because the mind of the fetus would have to be very different from what it actually is in order to have these conceptual dispositions. But as the child grows, of course, there'll be a whole range of borderline cases where you don't know whether there's a fact of the matter or there isn't, partly because we don't know in detail what's required for possessing phenomenal concepts. I mean, exactly how rich do your higher order thought capacities have to be? Do you have to be a language user? I mean, we don't even know that, I think, whether, partly because for that reason, But I don't care. And because there's no substantive question being asked here, I say, yeah, you can, as a philosopher, you could get yourself, spend a lot of time working out exactly what the requirements for having a phenomenal concept are and trying to nail down exactly when it makes sense to project one of your phenomenal concepts into the mind of a child.
Yeah.
Why bother? There's no extra fact that you're getting at there other than the facts about the child's conceptual capacities. And that's really interesting. But the further question, and where, as the child develops, can I project my own phenomenal concepts into its mind and have it be there's a fact of the matter about it applying? Who cares? I don't.
And amongst full-grown humans?
Yeah, there'll be a similar kind of set of borderline cases where we're unsure whether it makes sense to project a concept into their mind or not. And again, I say, I have a paper recently that's coming out where the title is "Stop Caring About Consciousness."
Yeah, I saw
and
that.
That's what I think we should do. I mean, phenomenal consciousness is a waste of everyone's time. And I wrote a whole book about a topic that wastes everyone's time.
Wasted 30 years, Peter. What's going on here?
Pretty much.
Yeah, that paper it's coming out, Phil Topics. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, part of the reason why people get all worked up about this issue is because of the moral issues, right? They think that, if you're saying there's no fact of the matter about infants and humans and the cat over there, then we'll just do whatever we want to them. Certainly, I think that was Descartes' view, right? That they're just machines, that doesn't matter. But that's not your view. In fact, you've for many, many years defended the idea that there are non-phenomenally conscious states that matter, like their intentions, their desires, and so forth.
Right.
And so,
no, I think, and even stronger actually than I argued in the book. I mean, in the book, what I said was empathy doesn't require sympathy doesn't require projecting one's own experience into the mind of another, right? You can be sympathetic for someone just by caring about whether they get what they want or not, for example, right? So one doesn't have to have fellow feeling with the other creature in order to want to ameliorate its situation or help it get what it wants or take its pain away or something. But in the book, I said, well, maybe empathy requires fellow feeling, and maybe that implicates phenomenal consciousness. But empathy is a bad idea anyway, and I drew on Paul Bloom's book Against Empathy, where he argues that it really is a bad thing, and you're much better off just with something much more straightforward. But I now think that was a mistake, that there's a kind of ambiguity in fellow feeling. So I think I can fellow feel a pain with a cat in that the first order contents involved in pain perception are something that I can feel, and I can imagine that taking place in the cat. And pains are feelings, so I think they can be a representation, an imaginative representation of what it is that the cat is feeling. But then in philosophy, we use this term feel in a technical sense too, to mean the feel of experience.
Right.
Where, colors have feels. Color perceptions have feels and things, right? And it makes perfectly good sense to say that there might be feelings that lack feel, right? So perceptions of and I think there are lots of them actually. So there are perceptions of bodily posture, for example, that aren't phenomenally conscious, but that nevertheless play a role. You adjust your posture without being aware that it become uncomfortable.
Right.
So I think even empathy actually can make perfectly good sense across the border of creatures that either don't have phenomenal consciousness or where there's no fact of the matter whether they're phenomenally conscious, because there is a fact of matter about whether they're feeling pain. And then you can be in a state of fellow feeling with that pain where your feeling is de facto phenomenally conscious, and there's no fact of the matter about whether their feeling is phenomenally conscious. But it's not the phenomenally conscious bit that makes it bad. It's the feeling, the
having
represented pain, the having of the feeling, which is bad.
So I wonder if you're aware of the work of Jeff Lee. Do you know Jeff Lee? He's a philosopher at UC Berkeley. Was a student at NYU a while back. Yeah, because he's written some stuff about kind of deflationary pluralism about consciousness, that there may be states of the zombie that matter just as much to the zombie as, you know, our states matter, even though they're not conscious. And so I was wondering if you felt that there was some kind of similarity, but if you haven't read or encountered that stuff.
I mean, what you say sounds true to me. Yeah. Yes, I mean that zombies would matter.
So you do agree with that. All right. So then on your view, we have reasons to treat animals in particular ways to minimize their suffering, but not because they're conscious or phenomenally conscious, but simply because they have these representational states that play these big characteristic roles and so forth.
Yep, and in particular, they have valence states. I mean, states that they take to be good or bad in the same sort of way that we take states to be good or bad.
Do you think that's then an important part? If they didn't have valence states, would it then become morally neutral how we treat them?
Yes. Do I think? Yeah, I think that. Yes. Yeah. It's the goodness and badness components of experiences that make them morally significant.
So there's this thought experiment that David Chalmers has talked about involving Vulcans. These hypothetical creatures that he postulates that are phenomenally conscious, but only visually and auditorily. They have experience, but they don't have any valence states. They don't feel, they don't care. Like, but he still thinks it would be immoral to kill such a creature or treat it wrong.
Oh, right. Well, that's another matter. I mean, it would be, there's no need to feel sympathy for such a creature because it doesn't suffer, it doesn't find anything bad. But whether that creature has moral standing is a completely other matter, right? And I could be a Kantian, say, about what confers moral standing.
Right.
And say, well, yes, this is a rational being, and so, of course, is a center of value, and I should respect that center of value, and so on. And I could be a Kantian, but still think that sympathy is demanded for certain kinds of creatures. So I wouldn't feel sympathetic for that being, but I'd feel sympathetic for the cat.
I see.
And so there might be a reason not to do nasty things to the cat, even though the cat isn't a rational creature in the same way that the Martian is.
And so how does all these ideas translate over to the non-biological cases? Like, should we worry about Roombas? I mean, I think about Roombas a lot, those robotic vacuum cleaners that drive around. And I always feel bad, like when the Roomba battery dies before it gets back to its charging station. And when they get stuck in the corner, I see these YouTube videos where the Roomba's like bumping into the corner. And I'm like, someone help the Roomba. And so, you know, I think, yeah, is that anthropomorphization a little bit? Sure. But are there cases where you could ramp it up a bit and have a non-biological system that demanded that we treat it in certain ways? Or do you think that is
yes, absolutely. So I think that, I mean, project ahead and imagine that artificial intelligence has got to the point where, you know, you can create an android, a creature that, I mean, whether it looks like a human is neither here nor there, but let's suppose it's got a cognitive organization that mirrors ours, right? It's got perceptual intake, it's got processing of those intakes a bit like ours, you know, perhaps using slightly different algorithms and so on, issuing and conceptualized thought-like representations of the world, and it's got goals and has to choose between its goals and so on. And then I think we're just in the same position as was it the Martians that Chalmers was talking about, or was it the
Vulcans?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that it's not made of biological material, that's all, but the same, it's a rational being. Whether, and I have no problem either with, you know, if that being, that machine is provided with sensory systems that are intrinsically valenced for it, right? I mean, that it gives rise to direct motivation to get away from the stimulus or whatever,
Mhm.
that would be the equivalent of pain.
Mhm.
And so there'd be reasons not to cause the computer pain. But whether it's phenomenally conscious, again, I don't care.
But in the limit though, it seems like you could get a non-biological system on your view that was phenomenally conscious if it just had a global workspace sort of very like ours. Like in one case, like if we uploaded your brain to a computer, for example, would be
I mean, this is one of those places where you can get into a really technical discussion if it mattered. It might turn on whether dispositions are identical to their categorical bases or not, right? Because remember, for me, the phenomenal consciousness thing is about whether my disposition to use this concept can be projected into that other creature's mind, right? So if this disposition, if the dispositions underlying my current use were instantiated in that mind, blah, blah, blah. And if you think that dispositions are identical with their categorical bases, well, that's something neurological in the human case and won't be in the computer case. And so actually, there'd be no fact of the matter there, right? You can't, there's no fact about taking this disposition and putting it there. Whereas if it's contingent what the categorical base of a disposition is, then yeah, maybe it's fine. And again, I say I don't care. I mean, there are substantive questions that you could address, but they're questions about dispositions. And we shouldn't be addressing them because we think there's some important question about whether the computer would be phenomenally conscious or not, because it's not important. And it's not, well, it doesn't matter for anything for me.
Yeah, I mean, so hypothetically, if there were the chance to upload one's brain, then would this argument convince you it doesn't matter? I mean, you would say, if someone says, well, if you upload, you lose your phenomenal, you'll be a zombie. And you say, I don't care. That's not what's important to me.
I mean, well, hang on, that's not, since there's no extra property there, if I would be a zombie, the only way I could be a zombie would be to lose my capacity for higher order thought and reflective thinking and maybe language. And yeah, that would matter to me.
Right. Well, there's no fact of the matter then, is what I meant to say.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So if we shift to a case where there's no fact of the matter, yeah, I'd say go for it. I mean, there's going to be nothing missing that matters for anything.
Cool. Okay. So I wanted to ask you about some of the objections to global workspace theory. I mean, you spent a lot of time defending the theory in the book, and I think that's one of the nice. There's a lot of nice things about the book, but that's one of the nice things is that you really go through a lot of the current stuff here. And I know you talk about this, but I want to get you to talk about the role of attention in the theory, because as I understand the way you present it, attention is necessary as a gateway into the global workspace. And there's been some work against by the usual characters, the ones you label as the kind of anti-global workspace crowd. I'm thinking of Suchia and related characters like Christoph, but now and company. But so there's some work that suggests that attention is not necessary for consciousness, which I think would be bad for the global workspace theory if that were true. But you spent some time saying you're not really convinced by that. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why not.
Well, so I'm not sure which examples you have in mind, but certainly early on it was thought that just perception did not require attention, because when you do change blindness experiments, right, the kinds of things where you have pictures flipping backwards and forwards, and people just don't notice that there's been some major change in the focal object, right? The airplane has lost its wing or something. Right? So there's change blindness, but people immediately notice if you change the background.
Right.
If you change the background from, say, a forest landscape to an urban landscape background, right? And that suggested, well, no, all right. So when you've got people attending to something hard and they'd miss a change in the focal object, but they couldn't miss the change in the background, that suggests that background perception or just perception doesn't require attention. But then there's really nice work by uh, Michael. I know him as Michael. I'm blanking on his last name.
Michael
Anyway,
Cohen?
yeah, Michael Cohen. Thank you. Showing that if you just load up attention enough, you can get people blind to background changes too, to changes in the gist of a scene as well.
Really dramatic changes too, right?
No, where it switches completely.
Yeah.
And indeed, there's a really lovely paper he's got out just recently, because occasionally I surf around people's websites to see what they've been doing. He's got this paper wearing virtual reality goggles where you can use eye trackers to know exactly where people's eyes are being directed. And it's programmed so that they take all the color out of everything else. Yeah. Right. So whenever, I'm looking at a green forest and I move my eyes from here to here, and all the green is gone except for the bit where my eyes move to. And then I move it to here and all the rest of the green is gone and people don't notice.
Yeah. Right? It's really, I've seen a video of what it looks like from inside the VR camera for that, because I saw him give a talk just recently. Yeah, it's really quite amazing. There's like a little circle of green and the rest is just black and white. Yeah. And people are, they're really surprised. Some people notice, obviously, but some people don't. So one wonders what's going on in those cases.
So that's especially striking because we know that there is color perception in the periphery.
Right.
And its resolution isn't bad. So this is really an attentional effect. It's because attention tends to move with saccades. And so in naturalistic conditions, you're not paying any attention to stuff that is outside of your current saccade.
And so what's your take from that, though? So your take is that, so your take home message is outside of attention, well, excuse me, when there is no attention, there is no experience of the thing. That's basically the message.
Well, no conscious experience. I mean, we know there's all kinds of priming stuff that you could still do, and the sensory motor system may still be able to respond to what's not being attended to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I tend to use experience as a code word for conscious.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. I don't.
Yeah, right. I know it's gotta be careful about these sorts of things. Yeah. But I guess, yeah, so I wasn't really thinking about those sorts of cases, but I was thinking about the kinds of cases where they try to experimentally differentiate, showing that you could have attention without consciousness and consciousness without attention. And there are some cases where people have alleged that you can. I mean, some work by as I just mentioned, Christoph Koch and now Suchia, where they try to distinguish between the being conscious of the stimuli versus paying attention to it, and showing that you get orthogonal. They come apart in orthogonal ways and have different effects on the perceptual cases.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the details of that work, and so anything I say now, I think would probably be not helpful to anyone.
Okay. But generally, you would be sort of suspicious of work that tries to separate attention from consciousness.
Yeah.
And what about, so, I've thinking about bees and their bee dances. I've heard the bee dance described as a kind of global workspace. I talked to Bernie Bars, and he thinks the bees doing their dance is a kind of global workspace. Or that, excuse me, not the bees doing their dance, but that the hive becomes a kind of global workspace when the bee comes back and the bee is broadcasting information, and there's all these receiver systems and so forth and so on. So, I mean, what do you think about those sorts of cases? Do you think that that's really a case of a kind of global workspace there, or?
Well, it's an interesting thought. I mean, so Seeley did this lovely book called The Mind of the Hive or something, right, where he pushed that idea that there's a kind of distributed decision-making that takes place across the hive in lots of different respects when they're, for example, deciding whether to accept a certain new place as a new nest site. And you've got these various bees coming back, giving dances, saying over here and over here. And there's a kind of collective decision-making process that spreads across the surface of the bee colony. I don't know. I mean, it is an interesting question. I think one thing one can say is at a coarse grain level, yes, this is a global workspace. I mean, compare it to to some of the debates about extended minds and stuff, right? So remember Otto with his notebook, right? At a coarse-grained level, you can say, yeah, the notebook is Otto's memory. I mean, because it plays a similar sort of functional role to what a memory system does in a normal person and so on. But on a fine-grained level, it's completely different. I mean, for example, he can't consult his memory in the dark.
Right.
Whereas there's no problem at all about remembering things in the dark for a normal person and so on. So it really just depends at the level of functional organization that you want to pitch your inquiry, I think. And there's no fact of the matter about which is the right level, except unless it means the level that is most productive for science.
Right.
And there, I think it's just an open question how productive it is to think of the mind as, the hive as being a mind, or whether it's just a sort of helpful analogy that, you can see it that way sometimes, and I don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, because that's what I was kind of interested to find out about your view about whether you thought there could be kind of these group minds. Some people defend this idea, and Bryce Hubner is one of these guys who's in his previous work defended this idea that it could be group level minds and so forth and so on. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that at least in the B case, you'd be sort of non-committal depending on like what we were talking about.
And actually across for the question generally, because it's one I haven't worked on or thought about deeply. I mean, so what I've just said about it depends on what's the most fruitful one for science is, I think, would be my answer. But if you say, so what is the most fruitful level of description for science? I
said, exactly. Okay. And so I wanted to talk about concepts. I know I can't keep you around here forever, but if you have a little bit more time, I wanted to ask about the idea that there are no conscious thoughts, because I wonder if have you changed your mind on that? Because I thought earlier you were saying that you did think that thought like conceptual representations are broadcasted. But in your previous work, you've argued that only non-conceptual contents are broadcast, or at least that's the way I interpreted it.
Well, so here it's important to distinguish the two notions of conscious, access conscious versus phenomenally conscious. And there's two orthogonal sort of debates one could have here. So if you ask, are thoughts access conscious, right? Well, it sort of depends upon what you mean by thought. So if you mean something that has conceptual, propositional content, then yes, because as you hear the sentences I'm now uttering, I think that a semantic content is getting built into the sound stream as you perceive it, and you hear that sequence of sound as meaning, and then you go back and say what I've just said, right, as meaning that. So there's a proposition that's getting bound into the perceptual content. But if you mean by thought something like a judgment or a decision or a standing state belief that you'd formed on another occasion, then no, what you get into working memory is something that might be caused by such a state, right? So, if you ask yourself what you believe about such and such, and a sentence comes to mind into working memory, then it's not the belief itself, which has been globally broadcast. It's a downstream effect of it. It's what you do when you take that stored information and transform it into a motor plan, which is then used to generate a rehearsal of what you would expect it to sound like if that motor plan were executed, and then that result of that is in turn interpreted by the language system, and you end up with the content. And if you're lucky, you end up with the content which matches the content you started with. Not always, but if you're lucky, you do. But what you certainly haven't got is that very state here, right? I mean, it's as distant from that state as is your interpretation of what I say from my state.
Right.
I mean, I think of them as involving the same things. So yeah, I think attitudes don't figure in working memory, and so are never access conscious. Right? It's sensory type or sensory involving states that figure in working memory. But concepts can figure in working memory, and propositions can figure in working memory. There can be what we might call Kazim Kassan calls passing thoughts, right? When you're not doing anything and you think, oh, I wonder what I'll be doing tomorrow, right? And so there's a content there which is before your mind in working memory and is conscious, but isn't necessarily a judgment or a decision or anything of that sort. So that's the sense in which thoughts aren't conscious. Mm-hmm. Now there's a quite different sense in which even for those concepts which are globally broadcast or which do get bound into working memory representations, which is the way I think it goes, do those concepts make a constitutive difference to the phenomenal properties of the state, right? And that I think reduces to, do they give rise to hard problem thought experiments, or do they just influence properties of the state which give rise to hard problem thought experiments? And I think the latter. I think that they don't make a constitutive difference, they make a causal difference. So the standard example, hearing the very same sentence with or without understanding, surely there's a phenomenal difference there. I think, well, yeah, how you're going to parse the sound stream into chunks and so forth will differ in the two cases. And so the experiences will differ, and so it'll be the phenomenal properties will differ. But it's not the meaning which is itself phenomenal, on my view.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of very interesting stuff there. So just taking the first thing that we were talking about, the access conscious claim. So because I'm trying to make sense of a kind of something that you wrote about in the article on this, which I know is sort of also from the book. But anyway, you gave this example of looking at the trunk, and you want a trunk of your car.
Oh, right. Yes,
call it a boot. But so you're looking at a bunch of luggage or whatever in the trunk of the car, and you're trying to think about how to arrange it so all these things fit. Mm-hmm. So you want to say, okay, so maybe I'll move this that way. And as far as I understood the argument, your claim was you don't have a bunch of thoughts about how these things should do. Rather, you sort of picture the way they might fit together. And then you have a thought that says, oh, this is the way they'll fit together or something like that. So that what's actually conscious is the experience, some imaginative acts about how they might be arranged, and then a misrepresentation of that stuff as being a thought.
I mean, I think that's not quite the way I'd want to put. I mean, so now we're in the domain of basically imaginative reasoning, mm-hmm. right? So I think that's what's going on here. That as you look at the size of the trunk and its dimensions, and you look at the luggage that you've got stacked up next to you, and you're thinking, all right, so which do I put where? What you can do is take in working memory a representation of this bit of luggage, for example. You imagine it twisted onto its side. So you do the kind of thing that, Koslin spent ages doing experiments of. You do a mental rotation of the image and you place it there. And then you take this and do a mental rotation of the image and you place it there, and you see it's not going to fit, right? And so you spend some time playing with transformations of visual representations until you reach a fit. And when you reach a fit, you may or may not articulate anything to yourself. You may just go ahead and do it, right? You've satisfied the constraints. Or you may say in a speech, you may think, that's the way to do it. Put that one on the left, right? And that may express a decision, but it's actually sort of superfluous. I mean, you don't need to do anything like that to do it. And I think that's exactly the kind of reasoning that we have evidence that birds can do.
Right.
That it's this kind of prospection of where you're mentally rehearsing actions, forming imagistic representations of the consequences, and seeing whether they fit task demands or not, right? I mean, responding effectively in effect to the outcome.
You get that really nice example in the book, actually, of this kind of, I forgot what kind of birds they were, but they're trying to solve this task about using the stick to get something that they haven't done.
They were Calendarian crows, I think, who seemed to be especially smart.
Yeah. And they sit there staring at the setup for like 50 seconds or something like that, and then solve the problem. Really quite amazing. So on this way of thinking, then when they're doing that, what they're doing is broadcasting some representations of the shapes, or excuse me, of the lengths and the shapes and the distances and so forth. And in the human, so I mean, I guess I don't want to talk about the birds too much but in the human case, I thought the point was that you may have a thought like, oh, this is the way to do it. But at the first order level, so to speak, there are no thoughts. Like if you move the thing this way, then it will fit congruently with that.
Oh, right. I mean, so if you, I mean, let's focus on decision, right? So one would normally express the decision as something like, put this one on the back and that one on the right.
Right.
Okay. Now, as you're imagining the transformations, when you imagine this one at the back and that one on the right, there's a response to that which, as it were, recognizes that it satisfies task demands, produces positive affect. It feels good, it feels right, okay? And that's enough to set you moving, doing the thing, right? But whatever sets you doing the thing doesn't itself figure in working memory. It's a response to the representations that you've just transformed and arranged thus and so in working memory, right? And what commonsensically, what we think of as the decision is when you say, that one on the left, right? And you verbalize it to yourself. Now that's caused by the decision. It isn't the decision.
Right.
Right. I mean, I think we sometimes mistake our inner verbalizations for judgments and decisions and formings of intention and so on, when they may be caused by those things, or they may cause them downstream of themselves. But they're playing this intermediate role. They're not actually the things that do the work.
I see. So when you're saying that the thought or the thing isn't conscious, yeah, I guess I'm a little bit confused. In what sense is it not conscious then? I mean, it is access.
So it's not access conscious in the sense that it doesn't itself figure in working memory. In a weak sense, it might be higher order conscious in that you know that you've made that decision.
Right.
But then it depends on whether you think a state can be conscious because you know that it's there, although you've had to interpret it being there, right? Because on my view, the way you respond to your own inner speech is no different from responding to the inner speech, the outer speech of someone else.
Right.
It's received as input by the language faculty, and you have to interpret its content and so on. So if you're happy to say that you can be conscious of other people's thoughts, that your awareness of someone else's thought renders it conscious, you could say that about your own case too.
Yeah, I guess I wonder why you'd have to have that kind of symmetry there, because
because you can always say, by definition, by fiat, it's only your own states that true beliefs about which render them conscious. Yeah.
Well, I think you could do a little bit more than that. I think that, I mean, someone like David Rosenthal, what they're going to say is the difference is that you have to represent, the thought has to represent that you're in the state, and you can't do that with other people's states.
Yeah, fair enough. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, this is very interesting because now, so switching over to the phenomenological claim that you were making, if I may, I guess, because I do defend the idea of cognitive phenomenology. I think that there is such a thing. So I guess I do feel that there are these kinds of zombie problems, Mary problems with concepts, and Yeah, so I wonder if I could get you to say a little bit about why, I mean, suppose no one ever had a conscious thought, and then they suddenly came to have one. It seems to me a bit strange to say, well, there's no change in their phenomenology. Is it like it could be a zombie before, they could be a zombie afterwards.
But
But
the conscious thought here means, let's stick with verbalized thought, a sentence occurring in working memory.
okay.
And that's a phenomenally conscious experience, right? The question is just whether the conceptual content of that thought makes a constitutive contribution to the phenomenal properties, right?
Uh-huh.
So the way Benedictine and I tried to run this was, if you think of with respect to any experience that has a conceptual content, so I think we did this with duck rabbits or something like that, right, where you can make it go backwards and forwards, and try to get a zombie thought experiment going, not for the experiential components of the experience, right, the shapes and so forth, but rather for the concept that you deploy, right?
Right.
So you have to think something like, there could be a creature just like me in all respects, except that, and a creature that represents it now as representing a duck, but who nevertheless lacks this kind of experience, right? The phenomenon, the whatever you have when you represent it as a duck. And we couldn't get our heads around that one. I mean, I can do it for color, I can do it with shape, I can do it for, any non-conceptual content, which can be amodal, by the way. And you can do it for numerosity, I think, and you can do it for valence. But I can't do it for concept contents.
Yeah, but I guess I think I can. So I wonder if part of the issue here is sort of one's antecedents views, that because I sort of already think there's a phenomenally that concepts do contribute constitutively to phenomenology. I'm disposed to think that you can get this difference. You don't. So therefore you don't. So I wonder if there's kind of a problem with these sorts of arguments here, given that what they reveal more is like something about us rather than something about the thing we're talking about.
Well, so, I mean, maybe, what I would say is that some of the arguments that have been put up for cognitive phenomenology are not very good.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Right. So, right. So I'd want a reason for thinking that they're there that I can get on board with, because the people who are meaning blind and so on, I think. So I forget who ran that example, but you're supposed to imagine someone who's behaviorally and cognitively just like me, except that he never experiences the meaning of what's said to him. Right. It seems to him meaningless, right? And what's forgotten there is that part of understanding is access consciousness, right?
Right.
That if he's really just like me, then as soon as something's said to him, he knows what to say in reply, or knows what would follow from what's just been said, and so on and so forth. And then to hang on to the idea, but nevertheless, it seems meaningless to him. I can't get my head around it, right? Because he knows what it's about. He knows what's been said. He knows what follows. He knows what I should say, and yeah.
Right. So what's missing?
What's missing? Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, but you could run the same thing sort of about like zombies too, right? I mean, but you don't think that you have that sort of issue, because even though, so I guess the analogy would be that in our case, phenomenal consciousness, on your view, is access consciousness. So when you're told to conceive of the zombie, you're conceiving of someone that has all that same stuff, even the same concepts, right? This our experience, this E or whatever. But you think you can make sense of that, but not of the other thing. So I'm puzzled why you think you can make sense of the.
I mean, I guess because I think we do have these first-person concepts for referring to non-conceptual broadcast states, to experiences, but not for referring to concepts. I mean, I don't know how, well, perhaps you'll show me how you can do it, but I don't know how to have a thought myself and then say that concept and individuate it just qua concept rather than the word that I've used or the thing which instantiates that concept or something, right?
Right.
So I don't think there's phenomenal concepts for concepts.
I mean, I guess I do think there are that we pick it out sort of as that experience, what it feels like when we have the concepts.
So for sure, I can pick out the experience into which the concept is bound.
Well, that's different, right? That's
Yeah.
Right. I'm talking about the conceptual experiential part.
Yeah.
But this is the cognitive phenomenology thing is so confusing because there's so much disagreement about it. I mean, but what gives me a little bit of hope is that there's a lot of disagreement about the other stuff too. Like I meet people, they say, "Oh, this is what it's like business. That's all meaningless BS." And what are you guys talking about? And so I do wonder, like, how much stock we should put into these sort of these kind of arguments, because you find them even for cases where we don't think, I mean, you and I, for instance, agree about the what it's like thing about the experience of red, but maybe not about the concept of cat. But then I meet someone else, they don't even agree about the red thing. So how are we, are we all just sort of spinning our own?
Well, I mean, I think there are, there are kind of subtle issues here. So other thought experiments that have been used to get at the cognitive phenomenology case, which seem a bit more plausible. Again, I forget who produced this one, but the woman who does advanced math but has no sensory experience at all.
Yeah, I don't know that one.
So at a certain point, so she thinks about proofs and stuff purely amodally, right? So she doesn't have any inner speech or any of that kind, and she's gotten it. She's a brain in a vat, as it might be, right? But nevertheless, still thinking.
Yeah.
Now, it's an empirical matter whether that's possible. It's certainly conceivable. I'll grant that. And we're supposed to imagine that she suddenly sees the way a proof should go.
Mm-hmm.
And surely that's a phenomenal experience. There's something it's like to now see the way the proof should go, right? And I share that intuition, but I think that you can get it through some of the other amodal, non-conceptual components, which are phenomenally, or do contribute to phenomenal consciousness, like basically valence. So there's ease of processing, right?
Yeah.
That when you see how a proof can go, you can. There's a kind of temporal dimension. It's now easy to run through the various steps. There's a feels good to it. It's being processed fluently as you go through. Probably feels satisfying. So there is a component of experience that would be left behind in someone who has no sensory experience that would contribute to phenomenal consciousness. But it wouldn't be the concept per se, or it needn't be, right? You can say why this would feel like something without having to bring in concepts.
Yeah. So, but you can modify the kind of thought experiment slightly by making sure that person, she didn't have any valence states.
Yeah, well, then it's not so clear that I can get on board with the intuition.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Because it still seems like there would be a kind of aha, like feeling or experience that one had, a kind of rational sense of, oh, this is the way it goes. And I get that what you're saying, that it would be accompanied by, oh, this feels nice, or it's easier to go this way or something like that. But it seems like, so you absent that, you just don't share the intuition. I guess this is why I have problems with these sorts of.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very much a sort of niche debate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it is puzzling. I mean, a part of my view is that the reason why a lot of I do think the attitudes have this phenomenology, and that, sort of the phenomenology goes to the attitude, like there's something that it's like to believe versus desire versus to want, etc. And part of the reason why I think why people don't notice this is because every belief sort of feels the same. It feels like, like it's true, or like this is the way things are, or something like that. But so I also think the concepts matter. But yeah, it's not clear to me what way we can make any sort of progress on this debate in an objective way. I guess that's one of the things that in these other cases, I can sort of see a path forward. In this case, I can't. It's hard to see.
And interestingly, scientists aren't interested.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? I mean, so they're interested in consciousness, but the question of conceptual consciousness or cognitive phenomenology, I don't see anyone getting in on board with that one. And probably perhaps for just the reason that you're saying, that nothing really much turns on it, and it's for philosophers to worry about and stay up late.
Yeah, exactly. Way to keep ourselves in business. Somebody is saying in the chat over here, Platon's arm, saying just sort of anecdotally that a lot of mathematically gifted persons tend to say that they intuitively feel the answer. But of course, that could be explained by the thing that you were saying just a second ago, maybe these other kind of contents that are playing the role. Yeah, interesting. Well, as always, your work is very thought-provoking and very careful. I really admire the way that you follow the argument. You're willing to change your mind. You're open to new evidence. So all of the qualities that I admire in philosophers: less dogma and more argument, and more empirical stuff too. So I highly recommend your views, your books, and your work. But I do have to let you go because I can't keep you forever. But I do wonder at the end here whether there's anything which you were expecting maybe would come up which hasn't. And the answer can be no, but I do always like to check.
I think the answer is no.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of stuff came up that I thought wouldn't come up.
The other way around, right? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, just hang out for 1 second. I'll say bye off the air. But once again, thanks very much.
Okay.
All right, so we're off. We're clear.